The Costa del Sol is in southern Spain. It's sometimes known as the Costa del Crime because of some of the characters it's attracted from Britain. A Welshman, Eric Morgan, moved into this area. He'd been involved in a number of dubious deals in South Wales and the Channel Islands. In southern Spain, he quickly fell into his old familiar pattern. There were people there who could be conned out of their money.
Many people go to Spain. They get a little greedy, maybe. They can see the beautiful sun is on your back and the water's glistening and everything's wonderful until you fall into the grip of someone like Eric Morgan. I feel, if you asked me to express how I feel about the whole thing, you know, I feel as if I've been taken and shaken and I've lost everything. All my money's gone and everything like that. But the horrible thing about it is I can't do anything about it. And Eric Morgan knows this.
Eric Morgan, a multi-millionaire tax exile, is the subject of tonight's programme. It's the second in a special investigation into his business activities. In the first programme last week, we explained how he'd left a trail of ruined lives. It stretched from Porthcawl, where he then lived, across stormy seas to the Channel Islands. Tonight, we examined some of his international deals. The first began in Porthcawl. He'd persuaded a business associate to move there from England. That businessman was in for a shock.
Every other hand in Porthcawl touches your shoulder and says, "Are you seriously involved with Eric Morgan? The most hated man in Porthcawl." They all know.
Jack Purdy is a courageous man. He's still trying to escape from the financial web spun by Eric Morgan. Morgan and Jack Purdy got together almost 10 years ago. Eric Morgan and Jack Purdy planned a series of legitimate property deals. But there were other offers. One of them involved the sale of fake Chanel No. 5. It showed Jack Purdy another face of Eric Morgan.
And then he's got the Jekyll and Hyde. I'm sorry for the chap. He can't resist the opportunity to steal. It's like a kid stealing out of a pram, right? And he gets some sort of pleasure out of causing problems, domestic problems for people, right?
Jack Purdy regrets the day he decided to move to Porthcawl. It was Eric Morgan who persuaded him. Morgan was lining him up to be another of his victims. For 5 years, Jack Purdy has been fighting Eric Morgan. If he loses, it will cost him £100,000 and more. But in the beginning, he liked Morgan. He got to know him very well.
I felt sorry for him and the relationship for the first 2 years, because I wasn't living in Wales. I used to see him occasionally, was one of a younger brother who was a little bit irresponsible, who needed some advice. He had a good brain on him. Could never understand why he needed to step outside of the law, having accumulated such a vast fortune in such a short time.
The Chanel fraud showed Jack Purdy how Eric Morgan was prepared to break the law. At the time, they'd known each other for a couple of years.
The deal, which I named Strong Pong, materialised, and it was a joke.
But to Chanel, it wasn't a joke. It could have cost them a fortune in legitimate sales. The Chanel deal was put together by Eric Morgan, his lawyer from Jersey, Richard Martin, and a fellow Welshman, Ken Jones. 18 months ago, Wales This Week investigated Ken Jones. We explained his connection with the Chanel fraud and how he tried to sell the fake perfume. At the time, we didn't mention Eric Morgan's involvement. Tonight, we can tell the full story for the first time. The gang who made the fake Chanel couldn't sell it.
And they produced a consignment of 25,000 bottles of Chanel No. 5. And ultimately, the customer let them down and they were stuck with a cash flow problem, with a hell of a lot of perfume in Acapulco that they couldn't sell.
The fake perfume had been intended for South American countries where Chanel's name was not a registered trademark. It was stored in Acapulco in Mexico. Richard Martin was keen to put together a deal to sell the perfume. He flew out to Acapulco with a bundle of US dollars.
He had to turn up in Acapulco with cash. The only real reason for going to Acapulco would be to pay any protection money and to organise the air freight.
There was a meeting at the Post House Hotel in Cardiff when Richard Martin returned. They had to find the money they still needed to complete the deal. They asked Jack Purdy for money. He refused to get involved. Ken Jones had already raised £23,000 to buy the Chanel. Richard Martin had spent his ready cash flying to Acapulco and paying the protection money. That left Eric Morgan. So far he was in the deal, but hadn't paid out any money.
The only source of funds was Eric Morgan. And Eric Morgan agreed to underwrite the costs, which then left three people in the package, which was Eric Morgan, Ken Jones, Richard Martin. And Eric found the cash to enable Ken to buy return air tickets plus accommodation to process the package. Ken disappeared for about 2.5 weeks, and then as a result of phone calls that I received from the agent that he'd appointed in Kuwait, I realised that, as predicted, it was a bag of worms.
In Acapulco, the arrangements to move the fake Chanel were successful. It was flown to Kuwait. But there, Ken Jones couldn't sell it. The official Chanel company agent began to investigate. The fake perfume was impounded and later destroyed.
As a result of that, Eric Morgan, Richard Martin, and Ken Jones lost a hell of a lot of money. And farther down the line, about 18 months afterwards, the police got involved, and I think the chaps who were involved with producing the perfume were brought before the courts and sentenced.
Richard Martin, the respected Jersey lawyer, was named in the trial. But he was never prosecuted. The part played by Ken Jones and Eric Morgan was never revealed. The pair of them fell out badly. But Morgan and Martin were to remain partners.
But it's been a source of income to Richard Martin, although spasmodic. And I think that without Richard Martin, his new empire, which is offshore based, couldn't exist.
Eric Morgan's empire had now extended into southern Spain. He was becoming a substantial property owner there. But one of the deals was to follow the familiar pattern. Another Welshman was to be conned out of nearly everything he owned. Eric Morgan met Brian Keevan Baird in Spain. Morgan became friends with Baird and persuaded him to go into business. We took Brian Baird back this week. It was there he explained his bitterness.
Yeah, you ask me how I feel bitter. And the reason that I'm talking to you the way I am is that whatever this guy does, I want to personally make sure that no one else becomes a victim like I've been a victim. And in fact, you know, you think of Spain beware. You know, we all have this feeling when we come to Spain. But the last thing you expect is to be screwed by your own countrymen, you know, who's supposed to be a friend. That's how I feel so bitter. I mean, the guy took us into his confidence. He wined and dined with us, became friends. We were friends. But all along, obviously, he was scheming.
Brian Baird's friendship with Eric Morgan flourished. Baird was a retired hotelier. He's now working again in Wales, where he recalled his move to Spain.
Well, I'd always wanted to go, and I was a very keen golfer. And I'd reached a level of business where I could afford to semi-retire, let's put it like that.
The Baird family spent 3 months looking at properties south of Marbella. They found a villa they liked in Estepona, one of the wealthiest areas on the coast. They agreed to buy it. They were planning their move to a new life when the Spanish estate agent rang them in Britain. He had a surprise in store about the villa.
The property was actually in the name of an offshore company. And so he explained to me the virtues of owning an offshore company as opposed to property in Spain. The villa being the sole asset of the offshore company.
The arrangement meant Brian Baird would pay less tax in the deal to buy the villa. He'd already paid a £9,000 deposit. Now he was in for another surprise. The deposit was non-returnable. If he pulled out, he'd lose it.
I did express to the agent that I had paid the £9,000 deposit to buy a property and not a company. But he said that it would have to be, I would have to give up my £9,000 deposit. I made further inquiries into it and discovered that the company actually was owned by a Welshman, so I felt quite safe. That I was very grateful that I wasn't dealing with a Spaniard. I was dealing with a countryman, so I thought, well, things will be okay.
The villa was actually owned by an offshore company called Eureka. It was set up under the secrecy laws of the Cayman Islands. Inquiries revealed there were 2 directors of the company. One was Richard Martin, the Jersey lawyer. The other was Eric Morgan's wife, Valerie Morgan.
The one director was Valerie Morgan, who was the wife of the person actually who I was buying the house off, but you will find never mentioned in this.
And who was that person?
A chap by the name of Eric Morgan.
Who was the other director?
A lawyer from Jersey, Richard Martin.
But you believed, despite the fact they were directors of the company, that you were actually buying the villa from Eric Morgan?
Yeah.
What made you believe that?
Well, Eric did all the negotiation. He came to the house, and it was obvious I was buying the house off Eric Morgan.
This was the deal. Brian Baird paid Eric Morgan £78,000 for all the shares in the company, Eureka. So Baird, in effect, bought the villa because it was owned by the company, Eureka. Brian Baird also agreed to retain Richard Martin as legal director to do the paperwork. The Baird family began their new life. They were flattered when Eric Morgan wanted to be friendly.
Eric Morgan contacted me again and invited my wife and I to join him and his wife out for dinner, which we did and got on very well with them. In fact, Eric Morgan's wife and my wife became quite friendly.
And so did the 2 men. They met whenever Eric Morgan was in Spain. It was natural that their conversation would turn to business and financial opportunities. So Brian Baird wasn't particularly surprised when Eric Morgan asked for a favour.
Eric asked me if I could keep my eye open for properties in Spain, business properties. So I said, well, certainly I will. I said, I'm not interested myself because, you know, I like to play golf and have a bit of an easy life. But anyway, I said yes, I would.
It wasn't long before he saw a promising opportunity. A restaurant called the Amara was up for sale. It was close to Baird's villa. He knew it was popular. Personalities like Jimmy Tarbuck and Stan Stennett used to eat there. It could sit up to 200 people. Brian Baird contacted Eric Morgan. They met. Eric Morgan brought along his assistant, Ron Draper. He was a former Cardiff bank manager. Draper was to become a key figure in the Amara restaurant deal.
Eric and Ron were constantly at my house talking about this restaurant. He was very excited about it, and Mr. Draper did express to me that if I got involved with Eric, I would be his man in Spain and things would develop. And I suppose being a chap that likes to be involved in business, I started to get tempted. I did offer my services in a managerial position, which, yeah, they thought that was a good idea.
Brian Baird started work on the restaurant. He used his own money to redecorate it and put in new fittings. During this period, Ron Draper approached him again.
Brian, he said, Eric and I feel that this is a marvellous opportunity for us all, but to show your commitment to it, would you put in some money? By this time, they had me hooked, so I paid 50% of the deposit, which was £6,500, £6,750, something like that.
They bought the Amara restaurant through yet another offshore company, based this time in Gibraltar. The offshore company paid £135,000 for the restaurant. The restaurant was run by a Spanish trading company they set up. It was called Amara SA. By the time the restaurant opened, Brian Baird had put in nearly £50,000. It was successful until one day 3 months later. Then a cleaner's paycheck bounced at the bank.
So we got in the car with the young lady and went to the bank, demanded to see the bank manager, showed him my statement, which I had received the day before, showing me to be between £9,000 and £10,000 in the black, and said, excuse me, how have you refused to honour a cheque of £60? The bank manager looked at me, then looked at Ron Draper and said, I think your man should have a word with you. Ron Draper was deathly white, and I said, what the hell's happened? Ron Draper, on Eric Morgan's instructions, had transferred all the money from the bank account of Amara SA, the Spanish trading company, to the offshore account in Gibraltar. I couldn't believe it. I said to Ron Draper, what the hell are you doing? And he said, oh, it's Eric's instructions.
Within weeks, Brian Baird had shut down the restaurant and decided to pull out. He'd lost nearly £50,000. The restaurant was now owned by Eric Morgan. Brian Baird then decided to sell his villa to get back some of the losses. But the paperwork had never been done. Eric Morgan effectively controlled the villa. In despair, the Baird family returned to Britain. He tried to contact Eric Morgan. A meeting was arranged at Happy Valley Caravan Park near Porthcawl, the base of Eric Morgan's business empire. Morgan gave Baird another shock.
He put a statement in front of me to say that I owed him £47,000.
On top of everything else
Yeah.
you'd paid.
I owe you £47,000. I said, no, you've got it wrong. You owe me more than £47,000. Eric got up and left the room. Ron Draper stood there, or sat there, and I honestly, I thought it was a joke.
It was another turn of the screw. Brian Baird bought his villa for £78,000. They'd found a buyer willing to pay £128,000. That would have given him £50,000 profit. It was enough to cover the loss on the restaurant. But Morgan wanted even that.
Ron Draper said to me, Brian, did I not warn you in Spain? How the hell do you think Eric Morgan is as wealthy as he is today? He said, you are just one of many victims. He said, don't let Eric, you and me, tell you that, like.
There was worse to come. The villa had been owned by a company called Eureka. Eric Morgan had controlled the company. Unknown to Brian Baird, the villa was used as security by the company to borrow £50,000 from a Spanish bank. That money also had to be paid back when the villa was finally sold at a meeting last autumn.
The meeting was held. The prospective purchaser came out and shook my hand and said, Brian, I've bought your villa. I've just paid the lawyer. Great. And now I couldn't understand how I couldn't allow to be at the meeting because my name wasn't on the bloody share certificate. So, I said, that's great. I said, oh, wonderful. How's it all been done? And he said, well, I'm going to give you £8,000 now. There is an outstanding thing at the bank for £50,000. I said, you're mistaken. Eric Morgan has been paid, half an hour ago, £47,500. I said, I can't believe it. I said, you haven't paid him for... They said, we've paid him £47,500. Because your last words were, before the meeting was held, sell the house and let's get this finished with. Sell it. I want you to buy my house. Buy it. And that's how the deal ended up. And I got £8,000.
The loser was Brian Baird. In 2 years, he'd lost his villa and his share of a profitable restaurant. The winner was Eric Morgan. He'd gained the restaurant. It was now worth about £200,000. His total outlay was £30,000. Baird couldn't believe it. He asked Ron Draper, what makes Eric Morgan tick?
I said, well, what does he do as, you know, I play golf as a hobby. What do? You play golf as a hobby. What does Eric Morgan do? He said, what he's doing to you. I said, pardon? He said, what he's doing to you, he said. That's what he does. He plays with people.
Eric Morgan has left a trail of victims. In the last 2 weeks, our special investigation has told the story of just 6 of them. Our file on Eric Morgan contains the stories of more victims and their allegations against him. We've asked Eric Morgan to answer these allegations. That invitation is still open. We are passing our dossier on Eric Morgan to the police.